Hi, I'm Chris, a trucker from Houston. I'm 40 years old and I have a story I want to share. A story about how loneliness and the search for comfort can lead to unexpected and complicated situations. It all started about 2 years ago. I was going through a rough patch. My wife Sarah had left for 6 months for a job in another state. We'd been together for 15 years, and her absence felt very acute. The house seemed empty. The evenings dragged on endlessly. I felt lost and lonely. At that time, I was working as a long-haul truck driver. This meant that I spent most of my time on the road, alone with my thoughts. The long hours behind the wheel only exacerbated the feeling of isolation. I began to notice that I was thinking more and more about home, about Sarah, about how much I missed her. One day, after returning from another trip, I received an unexpected call. It was Linda, Sarah's mother. She knew about my schedule and that I was often home alone. Linda offered to keep me company on a fishing trip the coming weekend. "You need to get out, Chris," she said. "You can't sit within four walls all the time." I was surprised by this offer. Linda and I had always gotten along, but we had never been particularly close. She was an energetic woman in her 60s, always active and full of life. Her husband had died a few years ago, and she had been living alone since then. Perhaps she was lonely too. At first, I hesitated, but then I decided that it really could help me take my mind off things. We agreed to meet on Saturday morning at a small lake outside the city. The day turned out to be beautiful, warm, sunny with a light breeze. Linda arrived in her old pickup truck, loaded with fishing gear. We settled on the shore, cast our lines, and started talking. At first, the conversation was awkward. We discussed the weather, the fish, my job, but gradually the atmosphere became more relaxed. Linda turned out to be a great conversationalist. She knew how to listen and tell interesting stories from her life. I caught myself thinking that for the first time in a long time, I felt relaxed. We laughed at her jokes, shared memories about Sarah. Linda talked about what Sarah was like as a child, and I talked about our first dates. Time flew by unnoticed. By evening, when the sun began to set, we packed up our things and headed home. I was surprised at how much I had enjoyed the day. As we said goodbye, Linda suggested we repeat our outing in a week. I gladly agreed. Thus began our regular meetings. We went fishing, walked in the park, sometimes just sat at Linda's house over a cup of coffee. I began to notice that I was looking forward to these meetings. They became an outlet for me, a way to forget about loneliness and longing for Sarah. Linda was an amazing woman. Despite the age difference, she was easy and interesting to be with. She knew how to support me in difficult moments, to cheer me up when I was sad. I began to see her not just as a mother-in-law, but as a close friend. But gradually, something began to change. I began to notice that Linda started dressing more carefully for our meetings. She touched me more often, accidentally brushing my hand, patting my shoulder. I chalked it up to friendly affection, but somewhere deep down, I began to understand that something more was happening. One evening we were sitting at Linda's house. I was talking about my last trip, and she was listening attentively. Suddenly, Linda took my hand and looked into my eyes. "Chris," she said quietly, "have you thought that something is happening between us?" I froze. Of course, I had thought about it, but I tried to push these thoughts away, considering them wrong, even shameful. Now that Linda had said it out loud, I could no longer deny the obvious. "Linda," I began hesitantly, "I don't know what to say. You're my wife's mother. We shouldn't—" She interrupted me, putting a finger to my lips. "I know, Chris, but can we control our feelings? We're both lonely. We need each other. What's wrong with that?" I looked into her eyes and saw a reflection of my own longing and desire for closeness. At that moment, all arguments seemed unimportant. I pulled Linda to me and kissed her. What happened next was like a fog. We gave in to our feelings, forgetting about everything in the world. It was a strange combination of passion and tenderness, desire and guilt. I felt more alive than ever, and infinitely guilty at the same time. In the morning, I woke up with a heavy heart. Reality came crashing down on me with full force. I had betrayed Sarah, my wife, with her own mother. How could I have let this happen? What to do now? Linda didn't seem to have such torments. She was calm and even cheerful. "Chris," she said at breakfast, "you don't need to torture yourself. What happened between us is natural. We are adults. We don't owe anyone an explanation. But I couldn't accept this point of view. I was consumed with guilt. I couldn't look Linda in the eye. I couldn't imagine how I would look Sarah in the eye when she returned. The next few weeks passed like a nightmare. I avoided meeting Linda, immersed myself in work. I took extra trips just to avoid staying at home, but thoughts of what had happened gave me no peace. I started drinking. At first a little, to relax after work, then more and more. Alcohol helped me forget for a while, but in the morning the guilt came back with renewed force. Linda tried to contact me, but I ignored her calls and messages. I didn't know what to say to her, how to explain my feelings. It seemed to me that it was better to just forget what happened, to pretend that nothing had happened. But life had other plans. A month before Sarah's return, I got into an accident. Nothing serious, but I had to spend a week in the hospital. And there I was caught up in what I had been so afraid of, a conversation with Linda. She came to visit me on the third day. I was lying there, bedridden, and I couldn't run away. Linda sat down beside me and took my hand. "Chris," she began quietly, "we need to talk. I know you're avoiding me, and I understand why, but we can't just pretend nothing happened." I was silent, not knowing what to say. Linda continued, "What happened between us was a mistake. We both understand that. But mistakes happen, Chris. We're human. We're not perfect. What's important is not what we did, but how we act going forward." Her words were like breaking a dam. I began to talk, stumbling and hurrying, pouring out all my fears and doubts. I talked about how ashamed I was, how I was afraid of losing Sarah, how I couldn't forgive myself for the betrayal. Linda listened to me without interrupting. When I finished, she was silent for a long time and then said, "Chris, you're not the only one. Many people find themselves in similar situations. What's important is that you recognize your mistake and repent of it. This doesn't make you a bad person, just a person." We talked for several hours. We discussed what to do next, how to live with this burden. Linda suggested that we no longer see each other alone, limiting our communication to Sarah's presence. I agreed, feeling relieved that we had found some kind of solution. When Sarah returned, I was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Every time she mentioned her mother, I felt like she was about to find out the truth. I became irritable, often snapping over little things. Sarah didn't understand what was happening, and it only made the situation worse. Several months passed. Gradually, the sharpness of the guilt began to dull. I still felt like a traitor, but I learned to live with this feeling. Linda and I kept our distance, communicating only at family gatherings, but one day everything changed. We were at a family dinner at Linda's. Sarah stepped out for a minute, and we were left alone. Linda looked at me and said, "Chris, I think we need to tell Sarah the truth." I was shocked. "Why?" I asked. "It will destroy our family, hurt Sarah. Isn't it better to leave everything as it is?" Linda shook her head. "Lies eat away at relationships from the inside, Chris. I see how you're suffering, how it's affecting your relationship with Sarah. If we want to move forward, we need to be honest." I knew she was right, but fear was stronger. "I can't, Linda. I'm not ready to lose Sarah." "Are you sure you're not losing her right now?" Linda asked. "Look at yourself. You've distanced yourself from her. You're constantly on edge. Do you think she doesn't feel that something is wrong?" Her words made me think. Indeed, our relationship with Sarah had changed. It was as if a wall had grown between us, and I understood that I myself had built this wall with my lies and guilt. That night, I couldn't sleep. I thought about Linda's words, about our marriage with Sarah, about how everything had changed over the past year. And by morning, I had made a decision. I woke Sarah up early in the morning. She looked at me with sleepy eyes, and I felt how much I loved her. "Sarah," I said, "we need to talk. I have to tell you something important." The next hour was the hardest of my life. I told Sarah everything, about my loneliness, about my meetings with Linda, about what had happened between us. I saw how her expression changed, from bewilderment to shock, from shock to pain and anger. When I finished, Sarah was silent for a long time. Then she got up and left the room without saying a word. I heard her crying in the bathroom, and I felt like my heart was breaking into pieces. The next few weeks were like hell. Sarah moved in with a friend, refusing to talk to me. I tried to contact her, but she ignored my calls and messages. I felt like I was losing her forever, and this realization caused unbearable pain. Linda was also going through a tough time. Sarah had cut off all ties with her mother, accusing her of betrayal. I saw how Linda was suffering, but I couldn't do anything to help her. We were both trapped in the consequences of our actions. At work, I could barely concentrate. Several times I was almost fired for being late and making mistakes. I started seeing a psychotherapist, trying to sort out my feelings and find a way to move forward. After 2 months, Sarah unexpectedly called me. She wanted to meet and talk. I was both delighted and terrified. What would she say? Was she ready to forgive me, or was this a meeting to say goodbye for good? We met at a small cafe where we used to go together often. Sarah looked tired and thinner. She sat across from me and looked into my eyes for a long time before speaking. "Chris," she began quietly, "these past 2 months have been the hardest of my life. I couldn't believe that the 2 people closest to me could do this to me. I felt betrayed, deceived, humiliated." I was silent, not knowing what to say. Sarah continued, "But you know what I realized during this time? I realized that despite everything, I still love you, and I want to try to save our marriage." I couldn't believe my ears. "Sarah," I whispered, "are you sure? After everything I've done?" She shook her head. "I'm not saying it will be easy, Chris. It will take time for me to trust you again. We'll have to work a lot on our relationship, but I'm willing to try if you want it too." I felt tears welling up in my eyes. "Of course I want to, Sarah. More than anything in the world. I'll do everything to earn your forgiveness and trust." We started seeing a family therapist. These were difficult sessions full of painful admissions and bitter tears. But gradually, we began to find our way to each other. Sarah talked about her fears and insecurities, about how she felt lonely during her work trip. I shared my worries and doubts. The therapist helped us understand that what happened was a symptom of deeper problems in our relationship. We learned to communicate better, to express our feelings and needs. I realized how important it is to be honest not only with your partner, but also with yourself. The relationship with Linda remained complicated. Sarah wasn't ready to forgive her mother, and I respected her decision. Linda and I agreed not to communicate except for the most necessary matters. It was hard for all of us, but we understood that it was a necessary sacrifice. A year passed. Our marriage with Sarah was slowly but surely recovering. We were learning to trust each other again, to find joy in simple things. I tried to be a better husband than ever before, cherishing every moment spent with Sarah. For our anniversary, I prepared a special surprise. I rented a small cabin by the lake, the same one where this story had begun. But now this place was to become a symbol of a new beginning. When we arrived, Sarah was surprised and a little wary. "Why here?" she asked. I took her hands and looked into her eyes. "Because this is where my biggest mistake began, and this is where I want to start a new chapter in our life. Sarah, you gave me a second chance that I perhaps didn't deserve. I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you that you weren't wrong." I got down on one knee and took out a ring. "Sarah, will you marry me? Again?" Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of happiness. She nodded, unable to say a word, and threw her arms around my neck. This moment became the beginning of a new stage in our life. We renewed our vows in the circle of our closest friends. Linda wasn't at the ceremony, but Sarah sent her a photograph. It was a small step toward reconciliation, and I hoped that with time, the wound in their relationship would also heal. Looking back, I understand that this story taught me a lot. I learned the value of honesty and loyalty. I realized how easy it is to lose what is truly important by giving in to a fleeting weakness. But I also learned about the power of forgiveness and that true love can survive even the toughest trials. Now, 3 years after those events, I can say that our marriage with Sarah is stronger than ever. We have learned to cherish every day spent together. We have become more open with each other, learned to talk about our fears and desires. The relationship with Linda is gradually normalizing. Sarah has started communicating with her mother, though still cautiously. We don't talk about the past, but I see that they are both trying to restore their bond. This story taught me that there are no mistakes that can't be fixed if there is a sincere desire and willingness to work on oneself. but the price of these mistakes can be very high. So I want to say to everyone who is listening to this story, appreciate what you have. Don't let loneliness or a moment of weakness destroy what you've built over the years. Be honest with yourself and your loved ones, and remember that true love is capable of overcoming any obstacles if you are ready to fight for it. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it will help someone avoid similar mistakes or find the strength to correct those already made. Take care of your loved ones and be happy. Did you like this story? Let us know in the comments what you liked. Subscribe to our storytelling podcast. Also, don't forget to like and ring the bell so you don't miss more interesting stories. See you soon.